On July 4, 1946, more than 200,000 people gathered in absolute silence on a hill in Gdańsk, Poland. The reason? To witness the chilling mass execution of 11 young women, former Nazi guards of the Stutthof concentration camp. In front of the crowd, these women, some barely 20 years old, stood waiting with a rope around their necks, condemned for torturing, murdering, and sending thousands of innocent victims to their deaths. What led these young women to transform into ruthless monsters? This is the harrowing story behind the brutal final fate of the most wicked female guards of Nazism. Stutthof, the last Nazi hell and the silenced massacre of the Holocaust. The Stutthof concentration camp, located near the city of Gdańsk, formerly Danzig, Poland, represents one of the darkest and least known episodes of the Holocaust. Established on September 2, 1939, one day after the German invasion of Poland, Stutthof was the first Nazi concentration camp outside German borders and the last to be liberated by Allied forces on May 9, 1945. During its operation, approximately 110,000 people were deported to Stutthof, of whom more than 85,000 lost their lives due to inhumane conditions, disease, executions, and forced labor. Before the invasion of Poland, Nazi authorities in the Free City of Danzig had already identified the Polish and Jewish intelligentsia as primary targets. The Free City of Danzig, an autonomous territory under the supervision of the League of Nations since 1920, had been a focal point of tensions between Germany and Poland due to the significant German population residing there and the Third Reich's interest in annexing the region. With the Nazis' rise to power in 1933, policies of Germanization and segregation were implemented more rigorously, and anti-Semitic sentiment intensified, setting the stage for future deportations and mass executions. Since 1936, German intelligence services, in collaboration with local Nazi sympathizers, began gathering information on members of the Polish intelligentsia, Jewish intellectuals, political leaders, and social activists. The lists of subversive elements included professors, writers, doctors, priests, businessmen, and prominent figures in the Jewish and Polish communities. To the Nazis, these groups represented a potential threat to their control over Danzig and their plans to annex the territory. The strategy was clear: eliminate the leaders and influential personalities of Polish society to facilitate absolute domination of the region and weaken any possible organized resistance. In parallel with intelligence gathering, Nazi authorities began searching for strategic locations to establish internment centers. The original idea was to have a secluded place where they could imprison, interrogate, and eventually execute the enemies of the Reich without raising suspicion among the civilian population or attracting international attention. Stutthof, a marshy and wooded area northeast of Danzig, was chosen for its geographical isolation and proximity to key transportation routes that would facilitate the transfer of prisoners. Initially, Stutthof functioned as a civilian internment camp under the administration of the Danzig police. In its first months of operation, the camp primarily housed Polish intellectuals, Jews, and political dissidents arrested after the invasion of Poland in September 1939. Conditions in this initial phase were already extremely harsh. Prisoners were forced to build their own barracks and expand the camp without proper tools or clothing for the weather conditions. Physical punishments, lack of food, and arbitrary executions began from the very first moment. As the war progressed and Nazi control over occupied territories solidified, the camp's function changed. In November 1941, Stutthof was transformed into a labor education camp administered by the German Security Service. Under this new scheme, prisoners were subjected to forced labor under brutal conditions, with exhausting shifts in armament factories, quarries, and infrastructure projects. The concept of labor education had no rehabilitative purpose. It was, in reality, a covert extermination policy through physical exhaustion and starvation. Prisoners who could not meet work quotas were immediately executed or left to die from weakness or disease. Finally, in January 1942, Stutthof was elevated to the status of a regular concentration camp under SS supervision, formally integrating into the vast network of camps controlled by the Reich. This change led to the camp's expansion, the arrival of more prisoners of different nationalities, and the implementation of more systematic extermination methods. From this point on, Stutthof ceased to be merely a detention and forced labor center and became another link in the Nazi death machinery. Over time, the camp would receive thousands of prisoners from Poland, the Baltic states, the Soviet Union, and later from other concentration camps such as Auschwitz. The original camp, known as the Old Camp, was surrounded by barbed wire and consisted of 8 barracks for inmates and a Kommandantur for SS guards, covering a total area of 0.12 square kilometers. These rudimentary facilities were initially designed to house a limited number of prisoners. However, as the war progressed and the Nazi extermination machinery expanded, the camp began receiving thousands of additional prisoners, creating a drastic need for expansion. In 1943, a massive expansion project began, transforming Stutthof into a large-scale concentration camp. The new section of the camp, built next to the old camp, was surrounded by electrified barbed wire to reinforce security measures and prevent any escape attempts. This additional sector contained 30 new barracks, structures designed to accommodate a much larger number of prisoners in extreme overcrowding conditions. The expansion increased the total area of the camp to 1.2 square kilometers and significantly boosted its operational capacity. In addition to the prisoner barracks, the 1943 expansion included other key facilities for the Nazi extermination machinery. Forced labor workshops were built where prisoners were compelled to manufacture components for the German war industry, mainly producing aircraft parts and munitions. Warehouses were also established to confiscate and sort the belongings of murdered prisoners, along with administrative offices for the camp's bureaucracy, which maintained detailed records of each prisoner and lists of deportations to other extermination camps. The camp's expansion coincided with its formal incorporation into the final solution, the Nazi genocidal policy for the systematic extermination of European Jews. During the 1943 expansion, Stutthof transitioned from being an internment and forced labor camp to an active extermination center. To implement this new function, a crematorium was built with the capacity to dispose of hundreds of corpses per day, reducing the time and resources needed for body disposal. A gas chamber was also constructed, specifically designed to carry out mass executions of prisoners. Stutthof's gas chamber, operational since June 1944, was designed to kill up to 150 people per session using Zyklon B, the cyanide-based pesticide used in other camps such as Auschwitz and Majdanek. The executions took place in a brick building with a single entrance and a small sealed window through which the executioners poured the Zyklon B crystals. Death by asphyxiation occurred within minutes, depending on the victim's physical resistance. However, as the influx of deportations increased in the second half of 1944, the camp's capacity became insufficient to carry out exterminations at the speed required by the SS. Most of the new prisoners were Jews deported from the Baltic states and Poland, along with political prisoners and resistance members captured in occupied territories. Faced with the overload, the Nazis began using mobile gas vans, hermetically sealed trucks filled with carbon monoxide. Prisoners were crammed into these vehicles under the pretense of being transported, and after just a few minutes, they died of asphyxiation. Once they arrived at mass graves previously dug around the camp, the bodies were unloaded and buried in large pits. Although less efficient than the fixed gas chamber, this method became a complementary tool to accelerate extermination. But systematic murder was not limited to gassings. Stutthof had an execution area where prisoners were shot in groups. The victims, weakened by hunger and disease, were lined up in front of pre-dug trenches and executed at close range. Witnesses described how, at times, the Nazis forced prisoners to throw themselves alive into the pits before being gunned down, ensuring that the bodies fell directly into the mass graves. Others were executed by a gunshot to the back of the head in a barrack repurposed as an execution room. In this facility, prisoners were made to kneel before a drainage channel that facilitated the cleaning of blood, and an SS officer would shoot them in the base of the skull. In addition to shootings, the camp became a scene of brutal beatings as a method of execution. Prisoners, especially those deemed too weak to work, were killed with sticks, metal bars, or rifle butts. In some cases, guards organized spectacles where they forced the strongest prisoners to kill others with their fists or rudimentary tools. These practices served not only as a means of extermination, but also as an extreme form of dehumanization, in which victims were forced to participate in the destruction of their own community. Forced labor at Stutthof also became a disguised form of execution. Prisoners were sent to perform exhausting labor, from building roads and fortifications to producing weaponry for the Wehrmacht. With no access to warm clothing in winter and barely any food, many prisoners succumbed to exhaustion. Those who could no longer stand were beaten to death or sent directly to the gas chamber. In the camp's final phase, when resources began to run out and evacuation became imminent, the Nazis stopped making an effort to eliminate prisoners in an organized manner. They simply abandoned them without food or water, condemning them to a slow death. The Ladies of Terror, the Stutthof wardens and their reign of cruelty. The Nazi regime did not rely solely on men for its system of repression and extermination. It also recruited women who played a key role in overseeing concentration camps. At Stutthof, several of these female wardens gained notoriety for their cruelty and sadism, becoming figures feared by the prisoners. Many of them had no prior military training or experience in such roles before the war. However, under the indoctrination of the regime and the power they were granted, they transformed into ruthless executors of Nazi terror. By 1944, with the growing shortage of male personnel due to the mobilization of soldiers to the Eastern Front, the SS faced a severe staffing crisis in concentration camps. To address this need, they intensified the recruitment of women in Danzig and other nearby cities, expanding the surveillance structure with female personnel. This recruitment was not limited to volunteers. In some cases, mandatory calls were issued targeting young unemployed women or those with prior service in state industries. Recruitment offices were set up in several cities, and propaganda networks were used to promote the role of women in the Nazi war effort, not only in munitions factories or agricultural work, but also within the Reich's repressive system. Propaganda posters, newspaper ads, and speeches at party meetings extolled the need for strong and committed women willing to support the fatherland in a decisive moment. Many women saw this as an opportunity to escape poverty, obtain more generous food rations, and gain job security that, during wartime, was uncertain in other sectors. In particular, those from rural backgrounds or with limited education were attracted by the prospect of receiving a stable salary and accommodation within the camps, offering them a more structured life than they had at home. Many had never held positions of power and suddenly found themselves with absolute authority over defenseless prisoners, a shift that for some led to a complete transformation in their attitude and behavior. While some women joined the system out of economic necessity, others did so out of ideological conviction. From a young age, they had been indoctrinated in the League of German Girls, BDM, the Nazi Party's youth organization for women, where they were taught discipline, obedience, and absolute loyalty to Hitler. Upon arriving at the camps, these women, previously educated in the idea of racial superiority and the need to eliminate the enemies of the Reich, found their new role to be a validation of these teachings. Brutality was not only permitted but expected. Those who displayed the greatest ruthlessness were promoted to positions of higher responsibility. Many were taught to view prisoners not as people but as subversive elements whose existence threatened Germany's future. The training of these wardens was brief but intense. They underwent accelerated instruction in discipline, prisoner management, and punishment, as well as strict physical training to ensure they could exert their authority without hesitation. They were expected to demonstrate absolute obedience to their male superiors within the SS hierarchy and to impose order without question. They were trained to handle weapons, recognize signs of insubordination, and apply physical punishments without hesitation. Many internalized this doctrine with alarming fanaticism, enthusiastically embracing their role in the Nazi repressive machinery. Over time, some even developed a sadistic pleasure in exercising their power, becoming more ruthless than their superiors demanded. The female wardens of Stutthof concentration camp played a crucial role in the Nazi terror apparatus. Among them, 4 figures stand out for the cruelty of their actions: Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Gerda Steinhoff, Elisabeth Becker, and Wanda Klaff. Jenny Wanda Bachmann was born on May 30, 1922 in Hamburg. In 1944, she joined as an auxiliary warden at the SK Three Women's Subcamp of Stutthof, where she quickly earned the nickname the Beautiful Spectre due to her youthful appearance, which contrasted with her extreme cruelty. Survivors' testimonies describe her whipping prisoners until they lost consciousness and showing indifference during gas chamber executions. As the Red Army advanced, Bachmann attempted to flee but was captured in May 1945 at a train station in Gdańsk. During her trial, she displayed a carefree attitude, laughing and flirting with her guards, further reinforcing the perception of her complete lack of remorse. Gerda Steinhoff, born on January 29, 1922, in Danzig-Langfuhr, initially worked as a cook. In 1944, she responded to the Nazi recruitment call for female wardens and joined the staff at Stutthof. On October 1, 1944, she was appointed block supervisor at the SK3 Women's Subcamp, actively participating in prisoner selections for the gas chambers. On October 31, 1944, she was promoted to SS Oberaufseherin and assigned to the Danzig-Holm subcamp. Later, on December 1, 1944, she was transferred to the women's subcamp of Bromberg-Ost in Bydgoszcz. For her loyalty and service to the Third Reich, she was awarded the Iron Cross on January 25, 1945. After the war, she was arrested on May 25, 1945, and during her trial she was recognized for her severity and involvement in execution selections. Elisabeth Becker was born on July 20, 1923, in Neuteich, in the territory of the Free City of Danzig. At the age of 13, she joined the League of German Girls and in 1938 worked as a tram conductor in Danzig. In 1944, she was recruited by the SS and arrived at Stutthof on September 5, 1944, where she also participated in the selection of women and children for the gas chambers and physically abused prisoners. On January 15, 1945, she fled the camp and returned to her home in Neuteich, where she was arrested on April 13th of that same year. Wanda Klaff, born as Wanda Kalachinska on March 6, 1922, in Danzig, worked in a jam factory before marrying in 1942 and becoming a housewife. In 1944, she joined the Stutthof staff in Proust, where she abused numerous female prisoners. On October 5, 1944, she was transferred to the Russoshin subcamp, continuing her sadistic acts. She fled the camp in early 1945 but was arrested on June 11 while suffering from typhoid fever. During her trial, she admitted to enjoying her work at the camp. All of them were sentenced to death and publicly executed by hanging on July 4, 1946, on Biskupia Gorka Hill near Gdańsk. Survivors' testimonies describe punishments carried out with particular viciousness, often executed without any justification, simply at the whim of the warden on duty. The methods of torture varied from prolonged beatings to psychological punishments designed to break the inmate's will. One of the most feared punishments was the ice cage. Prisoners, mostly women, were forced to strip and remain outside in the camp courtyard for hours under extreme weather conditions. In the middle of winter, with temperatures dropping below -10 degrees Celsius, they were made to stand still while snow accumulated on their bodies. Any attempt to cover themselves with their arms was met with beatings or doused with freezing water, accelerating hypothermia. Some prisoners could not endure it and collapsed. Others, still conscious, watched as their companions fell one by one around them, turned into motionless figures of bluish flesh. Among the most sadistic wardens known for the cold-blooded enforcement of this punishment was Jenny Wanda Bachmann, but the sadism of the wardens was not limited to physical torture. Psychological humiliation was as effective a weapon as the whip or the gas chamber. Prisoners were often forced to perform absurd or degrading tasks purely for the amusement of their tormentors. Some survivors recounted how the wardens organized games with the inmates, ordering them to fight each other, beat one another, or perform ridiculous dances under the threat of death. One of the cruelest tactics was forcing weakened prisoners to carry the corpses of their own companions for hours, without allowing them to rest or grieve for the dead. If they collapsed from exhaustion, they were immediately executed on the spot. Elisabeth Becker, another infamous warden of Stutthof, had a particular way of showing her contempt for prisoners' lives. It is said that she enjoyed beating sick or too weak to work prisoners to death. She would line them up in front of an execution pit and, with a wooden stick in her hand, select them one by one. The chosen ones were taken to a barrack where they were executed with a shot to the back of the head or, in some cases, were beaten to death by other prisoners forced to do so. In some cases, the wardens needed no excuse to kill. Wanda Claff, known for her arrogant demeanor even during her trial, was feared for her use of the whip. A mere glance from her was enough to determine who would live and who would die that day. Her specialty was beating prisoners to the point of unconsciousness and then throwing them onto piles of corpses still alive to let them die slowly from asphyxiation or internal bleeding. Beyond physical violence, there was a level of perversion in how these women wielded their power. Gerda Steinhoff, promoted to supervisor at Stutthof, boasted of her ability to detect signs of weakness in prisoners. Those who seemed on the verge of collapse were subjected to inhumane endurance tests, such as forcing them to carry sacks of cement for hours or dig massive pits only to be executed and thrown into them immediately afterward. But perhaps one of the most terrifying episodes described in testimonies was the use of attack dogs to tear prisoners apart. Some wardens, especially those of higher rank, trained dogs to lunge at inmates at the slightest sign of disobedience. The animals were fed a special diet to enhance their aggression and often attacked directly at the neck or face of their victims. Multiple cases were reported where prisoners were torn apart alive in front of their companions, while the wardens watched the scene with apparent satisfaction. The Stutthof trials, the hunt and conviction of the shadows of the Reich. After the fall of the Third Reich and the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps, the international community and the directly affected countries faced the immense challenge of delivering justice. In Poland, where the Stutthof camp had been established, authorities initiated a series of judicial proceedings to prosecute those responsible for the atrocities committed there. This was not merely an act of justice, but also an effort to document and expose the scale of the crimes perpetrated. The trials held in Gdańsk in 1946 set a precedent in accountability, as they prosecuted not only high-ranking officers but also female wardens, demonstrating that brutality within the camps was not exclusive to men and that responsibility should fall on all those who contributed to the extermination machinery, regardless of gender or rank. The arrests of the accused began almost immediately after the camp's liberation in May 1945. The disorganization of the collapsing Nazi regime and the rapid occupation by Soviet troops in the region prevented many of those responsible from escaping to safe areas. Some officers attempted to flee westward, hoping to surrender to the Western Allies rather than fall into Soviet or Polish hands, but most failed in their attempts. Others chose to hide in small nearby villages or major cities, changing their names and destroying documents that linked them to the concentration camp. However, the notoriety of certain staff members, especially the most sadistic female wardens, made anonymity difficult. The local population, aware of the terror experienced in Stutthof, quickly reported them to the new authorities, leading to the capture of several within weeks or months. Unlike the Nuremberg trials, which focused on the political and military leaders of Nazi Germany, the trials in Gdańsk took a different approach by prosecuting lower-ranking supervisors. This was significant, as it represented a shift in the perception of individual responsibility within the Nazi genocidal apparatus. At Stutthof, not only were SS officers who issued orders prosecuted, but also those who, despite not holding high positions, personally carried out acts of violence and actively participated in the oppression of prisoners. Among those captured were female wardens, an unusual circumstance in post-war tribunals, as although many women worked in concentration camps, few had been brought to justice until then. During the trial, which took place between April 25 and May 31, 1946, harrowing testimonies from survivors detailed scenes of extreme brutality. These statements included accounts of arbitrary murders, systematic torture, and mass executions carried out both in the gas chambers and in the forests near the camp. Witnesses described how prisoners were subjected to inhumane conditions, suffering constant physical and psychological abuse at the hands of the camp staff. The tribunal, composed of Polish and Soviet authorities, was determined to deliver exemplary justice. Of the 15 defendants, 11 were sentenced to death, including figures such as SS Oberscharführer Johann Pauls and the female wardens Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Ewa Paradis, and Gerda Steinhoff. The executions were carried out publicly on July 4, 1946, on Biskupia Gorka Hill near Gdańsk, where a large crowd witnessed the enforcement of the sentences. During the Stutthof trials, the attitudes of the accused varied widely, ranging from remorse to defiant denial. Some showed signs of regret or fear for their fate, while others downplayed their participation in the crimes or justified their actions under the premise of following superior orders. Among the most notable figures was Jenny Wanda Bachmann. During the trial, Bachmann displayed a frivolous and carefree attitude, even laughing and flirting with her guards, which sharply contrasted with the gravity of the charges against her. This behavior was perceived as a lack of remorse and a denial of responsibility for her actions. On the other hand, Irmgard Fürchner, who worked as a secretary at the Stutthof concentration camp, was accused in 2021 of complicity in more than 11,000 murders. During her trial, Fürchner denied her responsibility, arguing that her administrative role did not directly involve her in the atrocities committed. However, the court determined that by handling correspondence and documents related to the camp's operations, she was fully aware of the crimes taking place there. This stance of denial and justification reflects how some defendants attempted to distance themselves from their actions by pointing to the nature of their duties. The testimonies presented during the trials were crucial in exposing the magnitude of the sadism of some defendants. Survivors recounted episodes of extreme cruelty that went beyond orders received, revealing that in many cases, perpetrators acted driven by a sense of absolute power and dehumanization of their victims. These statements made it clear that, beyond blind obedience to the Nazi regime, Stutthof harbored individuals who took pleasure in the absolute control their position granted them. The sentences handed down after the first Stutthof trial were carried out on July 4, 1946, on Biskupia Gorka Hill near Gdańsk. Unlike other post-war executions, these were conducted publicly, drawing a large crowd eager to witness the punishment of the perpetrators. The decision to hold public executions reflected the deep yearning for justice among the population, which had suffered under Nazi occupation and sought a form of closure and retribution. However, the public nature of the executions sparked debates among observers and authorities. While some believed that these actions were necessary to satisfy public outcry and serve as a warning against future crimes, others argued that such spectacles could dehumanize society and turn justice into a form of public vengeance. Polish authorities, after observing the reactions and behavior of the crowds during these executions, began to question the effectiveness and morality of public executions. As a result, the decision was made to ban future public executions in Poland, moving these acts to more private and controlled settings to preserve the dignity of the judicial process and prevent possible public disorder. Despite the decisiveness of these trials, the question of whether justice was sufficient remains open. Although the main perpetrators who were captured were tried and sentenced, many others, including some high-ranking officers, managed to escape or were simply never prosecuted. Additionally, the speed of the trials raised doubts about whether each case was thoroughly investigated, or if some sentences were based more on the need to impose exemplary punishments rather than concrete evidence. However, what is undeniable is that the Stutthof trials in Gdańsk marked a crucial point in the history of post-war justice, demonstrating that even crimes committed by lower-ranking figures would not go unpunished. July 4, 1946. The gallows of Biskupia Gorka and the final reckoning. On July 4, 1946, Biskupia Gorka Hill in Gdańsk became the site of one of the most significant public executions of the post-war period, marking a milestone in the pursuit of justice for the atrocities committed at the Stutthof concentration camp. The preparations for the public executions on July 4, 1946 in Biskupia Gorka were meticulously organized to ensure both the effectiveness of the act and its impact on the community. The construction of the gallows was carried out with precision, erecting sturdy structures capable of supporting multiple simultaneous executions. These platforms were strategically placed in an elevated and clear area of the hill, ensuring optimal visibility for the thousands of attendees who would gather to witness the event. The choice of Biskupia Gorka as the execution site was not arbitrary. Historically, this hill held strategic importance due to its proximity to the main city and its natural elevation, making it an ideal observation point. During the 17th century, fortifications were built on the hill due to its strategic relevance. Furthermore, after the partitions of Poland, Polish insurgents from the November Uprising were imprisoned in these fortifications by the Prussians. This location not only facilitated crowd control but also added symbolic weight to the act, as it was carried out in a place rich in history and significance for the local community. The logistics of the event required close coordination between local authorities and security forces. Measures were implemented to manage the flow of people to the hill, establishing checkpoints and designated routes to prevent uncontrolled crowds. Additionally, medical and emergency units were deployed to address any incidents during the executions. The planning also took into account the psychological impact on the population. By allowing massive attendance at the event, the authorities aimed not only to punish the guilty, but also to offer the community a sense of justice and closure after the horrors endured during the Nazi occupation. The visibility of the gallows from various points on the hill reinforced this objective, ensuring that the event was witnessed by as many people as possible. The condemned, including figures such as Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Gerda Steinhoff, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, and Ewa Paradis, were transported to the site in military vehicles under heavy guard. Each had been found guilty of crimes against humanity during the Stutthof trials, conducted between April and May 1946. Their presence on the gallows represented the culmination of a judicial process that sought to hold accountable those who, under the protection of their roles within the Nazi regime, perpetrated acts of extreme cruelty. The event drew an estimated crowd of 200,000 people, reflecting the deep desire for justice in a society devastated by war and Nazi atrocities. Men, women, and children gathered on the hill, some seeking closure for personal wounds, others driven by the urge to witness a long-awaited act of retribution. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, from expectant silence to murmurs of approval, and at times, expressions of restrained anger. The massive presence demonstrated not only the demand for justice, but also the collective need to witness the punishment of those who had inflicted so much suffering. The chosen method of execution was short drop hanging, a technique that causes death by slow strangulation rather than immediate cervical fracture. This deliberately selected procedure prolonged the agony of the condemned, serving as a way to emphasize the gravity of their crimes. The effects on the executed were visible and disturbing: convulsive movements, congested faces, and a desperate struggle for air that never came. Each execution was carried out sequentially, allowing the crowd to fully absorb the impact of each death. The choice of this method underscored the authorities' intention to impose a punishment that reflected the severity of the offenses committed. Reactions from the public were mixed. Some spectators expressed satisfaction in seeing the perpetrators face the consequences of their actions, viewing it as an act of poetic justice. Others, however, felt discomfort or even revulsion at witnessing the brutality of the process, questioning the morality of responding to violence with more violence. Contemporary testimonies reflect a blend of relief and contemplation, with individuals acknowledging the need for justice while also grappling with the ethical complexities of public executions. This event in Biskupia Gorka not only represented the punishment of the guilty, but also served as a collective reminder of the human cost of barbarism and the importance of justice in rebuilding a wounded society. The mass execution at Biskupia Gorka on July 4, 1946, remains in historical memory as an act of retributive justice and a manifestation of the collective pain of a nation seeking to heal the wounds inflicted by Nazi occupation. This event symbolizes a society's determination to confront its past and ensure that such atrocities are neither left unpunished nor repeated in the future. The death marches of Stutthof, the exodus of the doomed. The arrival of the winter of 1945 marked the imminent collapse of the Third Reich. With the Red Army advancing from the east and Allied forces pushing from the west, Nazi Germany was in a desperate retreat. In this context, the order to evacuate the Stutthof concentration camp was not only meant to prevent prisoners from being liberated by the Soviets, but also served as an attempt to erase the traces of extermination. The directive came from the highest levels of the Nazi regime. Prisoners were not to fall alive into enemy hands. By late 1944, the commanders of Stutthof knew that their camp was doomed. The Soviet offensive in East Prussia had broken German lines and supply routes were collapsing. Aware that time was running out, Paul Werner Hoppe, the camp's last commander, received orders to evacuate most of the prisoners and destroy any evidence of the extermination machinery. The orders were strict. Sick and weak prisoners who could not march were to be executed on the spot, while the rest would be sent on forced marches westward, regardless of weather conditions or their physical endurance. On January 25, 1945, the SS began the evacuation. More than 50,000 prisoners were still in the camp, but only about 30,000 were deemed fit to march. Those unable to stand were left behind or executed immediately. There was no room for mercy or compassion. The prisoners, weakened by months or years of starvation, disease, and forced labor, were organized into columns that advanced at a forced pace through the icy roads of Pomerania and East Prussia. Some had no shoes, others wore rags that barely shielded them from the cold. Temperatures ranged between -10 and -20 degrees Celsius, and snow covered the ground with an unforgiving layer. The Nazi officers knew that many deportees would die along the way. In fact, that was the purpose of the evacuation. It was not a transfer, but a delayed execution. Guards were ordered to shoot anyone who lagged behind or showed signs of exhaustion. Local villagers were forbidden to offer food or shelter to the prisoners, and any civilian caught aiding them could be punished with death. In many cases, prisoners were forced to sleep outdoors in open fields or along roadsides, where the cold claimed the weakest before dawn. The columns of prisoners advanced slowly through the frozen landscape, wrapped in a silence broken only by the wind and the crunch of snow beneath their feet. The orders were clear. They had to march without rest, regardless of their physical condition. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or cold were executed on the spot. There were no stops for food, no prolonged breaks, and any attempt to stray from the group was punished with immediate death. Beyond the cold, hunger added to the torture. After days without food, some prisoners tried to eat snow to ease their desperation, but the cold sensation in their stomachs only worsened their weakness. The most desperate searched for roots or bits of wood to chew on, anything that would give them the illusion of ingesting something. Executions were constant and public. If someone fell, they were executed without warning. The Nazi guards shot without hesitation, leaving the bodies in the snow as a warning to the others. The march did not stop even for the dying. Prisoners had to step over the corpses of their fallen companions, many still agonizing, unable to move as the cold slowly consumed them. On some occasions, the guards even used executions for entertainment, shooting lagging prisoners in different parts of the body to prolong their suffering before delivering the final shot. The testimonies of the few who managed to survive describe scenes of absolute horror. One prisoner recounted how, on a particularly cold night, the guards ordered a group of deportees to huddle together for warmth, only to then open fire on them, leaving their bodies piled in the snow. Another survivor recalled that, at times, the guards simply grew tired of marching and ordered prisoners to dig their own graves in the snow before being executed en masse. These episodes of brutality were not exceptions. They were part of a systematic strategy of covert extermination. The prisoners who survived the brutality of the forced marches found no relief at their final destination. For many, the journey had only delayed their inevitable execution. A significant number of prisoners were directed to the Baltic Sea coast, where the SS carried out systematic massacres. On the frozen beaches and dunes, groups of prisoners were forced to dig their own graves under the watchful eyes of the guards. Despite their extreme weakness, those who did not dig fast enough were beaten or shot on the spot. Once the trenches were ready, the Nazis lined up the prisoners at the edge and shot them in the back, letting the bodies fall on top of each other in a grim pile of corpses. Those who did not die instantly were buried alive under the next round of victims in an attempt to conceal the massacre. For other prisoners, death came in an even crueler and more ruthless manner. Aware that Allied forces were drawing closer, the Nazis devised a quick and efficient method to dispose of large numbers of prisoners: mass murder at sea. Thousands of deportees were transported to nearby ports and forced to board ships under the false promise of evacuation. Weak and with no other option, the prisoners were crammed into the cargo holds of freighters and barges without provisions or ventilation. Once the ships reached open waters, the Nazi crews abandoned them to their fate or, in some cases, deliberately sank them by sabotaging the hulls so that they would quickly take on water. Within minutes, the ships began to submerge, trapping hundreds of prisoners inside. Some attempted to escape, but the frigid waters of the Baltic offered no salvation. Those who managed to get out of the holds succumbed to hypothermia or drowned before they could reach the shore. Survivors' testimonies described terrifying scenes. In some cases, prisoners still on deck were forced to jump into the sea at bayonet point while the Nazis watched impassively as the cold and waves did their work. Other accounts indicate that on certain occasions, the guards themselves shot at the deportees in the water, ensuring that no witnesses survived. These acts of mass murder at sea reflected the Nazis' final desperation to eliminate all evidence of their crimes before the imminent arrival of the Allies. Of the thousands of prisoners who embarked on the evacuation from Stutthof, fewer than 15% survived until liberation. Many who escaped with their lives did so thanks to the chaos of the Third Reich's collapse, hiding in forests or being rescued by local populations who, at the risk of their own safety, provided them shelter. Others were found by the Red Army, advancing relentlessly over the remnants of Nazi rule. However, even for those who managed to survive, liberation did not mark the end of their suffering. Extreme malnutrition, disease, and psychological trauma would haunt them for the rest of their lives. For them, freedom had come too late. Evidence of the horrors perpetrated during the evacuation of Stutthof began to surface immediately after the Red Army's arrival in the region. What Soviet soldiers encountered was a scene of absolute devastation. Roads littered with frozen corpses, remnants of mass executions along the Baltic coast, and prisoners too weak to even speak about what had happened. Military reports described terrifying scenes, with bodies piled in shallow graves and traces of hastily executed shootings in the snow. Some prisoners still alive were found in critical condition, unable to move due to starvation and disease, their faces marked by desperation and extreme suffering. The testimonies of the liberators reflect the impact of these images. Soldiers who, despite having witnessed the ravages of war on the Eastern Front, were shocked by the brutality of the extermination at Stutthof. Meanwhile, the International Red Cross and other relief organizations that arrived shortly after began documenting the atrocities. Detailed lists of missing prisoners were compiled, survivors' testimonies were recorded, and forensic reports were gathered on the causes of death for thousands of victims. These records were crucial in clarifying the crimes committed during the camp's final phase and served as critical evidence in subsequent trials. They also helped reconstruct the exact path of the death marches and estimate how many prisoners had been killed along the way or sent to their deaths at sea. With the evidence in hand, the search for those responsible became a priority for Polish and Soviet authorities. Unlike crimes committed within concentration camps, which could sometimes be obscured by the complex bureaucracy of the Nazi system, the evacuation of Stutthof presented a more direct case of premeditated mass murder. The extermination orders were clear, and the officers who supervised the marches and executions could not justify their actions as merely following general orders from Berlin. As a result, several of the high-ranking officials responsible for the evacuation were identified, captured, and brought to trial in Gdańsk in the years following the war. Among the accused were SS officers who led the marches, supervisors of prisoner transports, and members of the camp administration who had participated in planning the evacuation. During the trials, the survivors' testimonies were devastating. They recounted the guards' brutality along the route, the arbitrary executions in the snow, and the cruel methods used to dispose of deportees at sea. The evidence collected by Soviet soldiers and the Red Cross documents were presented before the tribunal, detailing the full extent of the massacre. The verdict of the trials was unequivocal. It was determined that the evacuation of Stutthof had not been a mere relocation of prisoners in response to the advancing Red Army, but rather a deliberate act of final extermination. This conclusion reinforced the historical recognition of the death marches as a crucial phase of the Holocaust, proving that until the very last moment, the Nazi regime prioritized the annihilation of its victims over allowing them to survive the war. For the captured perpetrators, justice was swift and severe. Many were sentenced to death or long prison terms. However, for the tens of thousands of victims who perished during the marches and at sea, justice came too late. Stutthof in memory, justice, oblivion, and the traces of horror. The legacy of the Stutthof executions and their impact on collective memory have been the subject of reflection and debate over the decades. Today, the history of Stutthof and its perpetrators is remembered through various means that seek to preserve memory and educate future generations about the atrocities committed. The Stutthof concentration camp has been transformed into a museum and memorial site, where documents, photographs, and personal belongings of both victims and perpetrators are exhibited. This space serves as a tangible reminder of the horrors of the Holocaust and provides visitors with a deep understanding of the inhumane conditions that prevailed there. Through exhibitions and educational programs, the museum aims to keep the memory of the victims alive and encourage reflection on the lessons of history. The role of female wardens in concentration camps, particularly in Stutthof, has been the subject of analysis and debate. These women, who actively participated in supervision and in many cases in the perpetration of abuse and murder, challenged traditional perceptions of gender and violence. Historical studies have documented cases of extreme brutality by these wardens, leading to discussions about their individual responsibility and the power dynamics within the Nazi regime. The figure of Jenny Wanda Bachmann, known as the Beautiful Spectre for her cruelty in Stutthof, exemplifies the complexity of this phenomenon. Her active participation in prisoner selections for the gas chambers and her behavior during the trials highlight the brutality that some of these women exercised. Biskupia Gorka, the site of the public executions of Stutthof war criminals, has gained significant symbolism as a place of historical justice. The choice of this location for the executions was not random. Its visibility and accessibility allowed a large crowd to witness the act, serving as a public manifestation of justice and a warning against future crimes. Today, Biskupia Gorka is recognized as a memorial site, symbolizing retribution and closure for a community deeply affected by the atrocities of war. This site reminds us of the importance of confronting the past and ensuring that the lessons learned are not forgotten. The memory of Stutthof and the executions at Biskupia Gorka remain relevant in Holocaust education and the promotion of human rights. Through the preservation of these sites and the dissemination of their stories, efforts continue to honor the victims and ensure that future generations understand the importance of resisting injustice and oppression in all its forms.